Over the last 3 years, we've done over 200 roster reviews, put together hundreds of trade suggestions, and helped rebuilding teams rebuild, competitive teams stay competitive, and help bridge the gap between rebuilding and becoming competitive again. Ultimately, we've looked at a ton of rosters and helped a lot of teams get better. Today, I'm going to walk you through some of the most common occurrences we've seen in these roster reviews. Some are mistakes, some are based on roster construction, and some notes are just strategies or things you should try to implement into your dynasty building strategy. But before we get into it, I do hope that y'all enjoy the video. Please leave a like if you do, comment down below what questions you have about building dominant dynasty rosters, and let us know some of your favorite strategies that you like to implement while building those dynasty rosters. And if at any point you'd like to say, hey, I'd like to have my roster reviewed, the details on how to do so are in the pinned comment below, as well as the YouTube description box. And another way to get 24/7 help building that roster right, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in that Discord server for a free 7-day trials and see what we can do to help you build that roster, turn that roster around, us along with that 200 plus strong Discord community. But with all that said and all the promo in the books, let's get to the content you came for. Now, these aren't in any particular order. I've got 10 of these I'm going through today, and there's certainly more than 10 things I could teach you today about how to better your dynasty rosters. There's going to be more videos ahead. I didn't want to take up 2 hours of your time today, but I've got 10, and the first one I have to share with you is going all in can really hurt you in the long run. This is definitely something to look out for more so in the regular season, but as much as we want to make every effort to win our leagues, going all in sometimes isn't the best option, especially if we're making moves that mortgage a ton of our future draft capital and any other younger assets that maybe we're waiting on development from. This can leave us short on options of how to proceed later on. And hey, if we're not getting any younger, we're only getting older. And on top of that, we have to keep in mind, even if we're going all in, we might not win the league anyway. I can only imagine that most of us have had that frustration of being one of the best teams in the league coming into the final week, and you run into a buzzsaw from the 6 seed team. While I'm not opposed to making moves that better your team down the stretch, but if I'm using future draft capital or assets, I don't want to just focus on 1-year rentals or short-term assets. I want to make sure I'm getting longer lasting assets in return, younger budding prospects, or maybe even players that are in their prime that are still relatively young that can help me for a good while. And as I've mentioned previously, I don't want to use all of my future draft capital. If you're making these deals, try to get some draft capital back in return as opposed to just sending it all away. Even if you're downgrading first to seconds, seconds to thirds, you get it. Some draft capital to play with in the offseason is better than none. One of the worst ways to start your dynasty league, shocker, is starting off with a bad dynasty startup draft that can honestly doom your dynasty league. Maybe not the entire league, but definitely your team. These are some of the most important picks you're going to be making, especially at the top of your drafts. I'd never advise spending them on players that have moderate risk when there are other players going around them in those early rounds that are just plain and simple safer. And there's not that much more upside to be had around those players that you're taking the higher risk on anyway. On top of that, you have to understand the league formatting, scoring dynamics, because this will give you a good idea of how to attack your startup draft. You need to know how big of a start size it is, if it's one quarterback or a super flex league. Is there any tight end premium? What bonuses are involved? Are there any other premiums like running backs getting a point per carry? And we talk about this a ton with our rookie drafts, but maybe not enough with our startup drafts. It's not always about knowing who to draft, but who not to. When it comes to these startup drafts, every draft or every dynasty league has a code that needs to be cracked that can help you build your roster the best way, conducive to league settings, formattings, player values, etc. Another thing to do is, while there might not be the sexiest names on the board right now, avoid reaching down the board as much as you can. If you're looking for more exciting players that are down the board just because they're younger, more exciting, whatever the case is, maybe have a little bit more upside, and you're passing over players who are just quite frankly better and have more value secured right now, this is a good way to lose out on value throughout the draft, where you should look to trade down as opposed to just making a pick, reaching down boards. You get it. And if you'd like help winning your next dynasty startup draft, we do have a dynasty startup strategy guide available in the YouTube description box below, written by yours truly. This is unfortunately one of the bigger mistakes we see in dynasty, as well as with our roster reviews. Rebuilding too hard is definitely a thing, and it's not as simple as just sell off all of your valuable assets for rookie picks and call it a day. And honestly, this is a mistake we see very often because it's so easy to do. It's so easy to get caught up in the fun and rejuvenation of a league because you're selling off everything else for future upside possibilities. And that is quite exciting. Most people view this as, hey, I'm starting a rebuild. It's time to have a fire sale and sell everything. And while, yes, we definitely want to move on from our declining assets, it's not as simple as everything must go. Pay attention to players that are worth keeping, as well as players that might be worth keeping, but just don't really fit your team trajectory at this moment, and whose value might wane while they're sitting on your roster, not helping you compete, and it might prevent you from getting that best possible draft pick in next year's draft. It's important not to just sell for anything that feels like proper value, especially if we're just selling for draft picks. As much as we love rookie picks and they hold a bunch of value, they also come with a ton of uncertainty. And on top of that, you have to expect a gradual increase in production from rookies. They can't all be top 12 players at their position their rookie year. And this means it takes you longer to get back to a competitive point. What I like to do when I'm starting a rebuild is I like to target a pick and a prospect being a rookie or a second year player, somebody who's been cooking in the league that little bit. And I'm always looking to get plus assets on top of whatever I'm sending. The thought process here is by obtaining a player that's already in the league, I'm shortcutting that process of getting back to a competitive state because that player's already worked their 1 or 2 years in the league. And now we're hopefully getting to that point where they're at their peak production throughout most of the rest of their career, barring injuries, of course. Another way to expedite rebuilds or better use the draft capital you receive in these trades is by selling draft capital that you acquire for proven commodities in the offseason before your rookie drafts. And the thing to keep in mind here is not everyone will be interested in the player you're trying to sell, but you can almost always get a good return and have league mates' interest in rookie picks before the rookie draft has happened. And we'll talk about that a little more later. When we make the decision to rebuild and start selling off assets, we have to realize we're moving further and further away from a competitive position with each asset we move. And this adds time to how long it'll take to get back to a competitive standpoint. And what's the absolute worst is sometimes we see teams that have sold off pretty much everything of value and they don't get enough draft picks in return. They don't get any players in return. They make poor rookie draft picks the next season before we've had a chance to help out with their roster, and this team is left in a tough spot. And when you're left without many solid pieces and less draft capital and total team value than that roster should have, that's a really tough place to be. In every dynasty roster build, league format and scoring need to be a focus. We talked about this a little bit in your startup draft. Maybe you weren't able to do that. Maybe you weren't as knowledgeable as you are now when you started that new league. But if you haven't built your roster conducive to league format and scoring, here's your wake-up call. Cracking the code on what your league format and scoring favors is paramount to winning your league. If it's a smaller start size, how can you consolidate depth into higher end starters? And if it's a larger start size, how can you get more startable players? And if there are premiums, how can you utilize and build around those? When you're able to learn how to analyze the formatting of your league, it can provide more of a direction in how you need to attack your roster builds. And that's something we do in these roster reviews. That can lead to highlighting positions to focus on. Maybe if you need more depth over higher end pieces, what positions need to be focused on? Do we need to add some players that pad that premium? Can we manipulate that premium to put more players in our flex spots that are actually pretty solid as well? And how can we overall build our roster more efficiently, conducive to league settings, as opposed to what the view might be on that player universally compared to this league dynamic that we have? One question that comes up every time when we're talking about rebuilds in the YouTube comments as well is the question of consolidating assets into one proven player when you start your rebuild. You know, a top tier player like a Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Justin Jefferson, someone of that ilk. And I'm here to tell you that consolidating assets at the start of a rebuild is rarely the right answer. When it comes to rebuilding or retooling, I'd much rather give myself more opportunities with more assets through diversifying as opposed to consolidating that give me more opportunities to build my teams in a more efficient way, as opposed to sacrificing what liquid assets I might have and sink them into one player that, hey, I built this, I have this player that's super great, whatever, but now that's the only player I have to build around, and I don't have a lot of other assets to diversify and really do much with the rest of this roster build. Ultimately, if I need to rebuild in the first place, adding one stud to my team probably isn't the answer, but diversifying into multiple assets to reallocate later, whether it's rookie picks or trading out of those rookie picks into proven commodities, whatever the case is, my team will be better off in the long run having a more stretch of assets to work with. It's that whole accordion concept that I talk about in a lot of roster review videos. If you've had a roster review and you've had me talk about this concept, you know exactly what I mean. But right now at the top of rebuilds, we want to extend our rosters, spread everything out, diversify as much as we can. And then once we're ready to start turning the corner, we'll start to reallocate those assets and consolidate more efficiently then. A harsh truth or a fact of the matter is so many players just are not worth rostering. And this doesn't mean to cut them, but it does mean, hey, while they should be rostered, They don't need to be rostered on your team. There are players that are needle movers and there's players that are replaceable. And learning the difference is a big step in Dynasty. And this is what our Keep Trade Cut series aims to do. Is this player worth keeping? Is this player worth trading because for some reason the market still values them? Or are they just somebody worth cutting that has little to no value and we don't have much optimism for their future, scoring wise? Don't miss out on that series. Check it out if you haven't yet. And ultimately, what we want to do with these players that just aren't worth rostering is we don't want to get hung up on these guys, because getting hung up on players that just really have no place on your roster, have higher standards, is it could prevent you from adding better talent or at least players with more upside. And who knows, depending on the depth of your league, you might be able to play the waiver wire in the season, grab a player with fab or using waiver priority, whatever the case is, and flip that player for a second round pick that you wouldn't be able to if you were hung up on rostering players that really just aren't going to make a big impact on your team. This next point here kind of plays into the same concept. Depth matters for sure, but make sure it's the right kind of depth. Depth does not equal bodies. Depth should really only refer to players that you can realistically put into your lineup any given week and expect some decent output from. I'm not saying these depth pieces need to score you 15 points a game or anything like that, but realistically, they should be able to put 10 points, 8 to 10 points in your lineup in a PPR scoring format league any given week if you want to quantify them as depth. Far too often we see teams, not only in the comments, but in these roster reviews as well, that feel they have a depthful wide receiver room and they feel like they can sell off some of those players, sacrifice some of that depth to better another position, when in reality, they don't really have the starting pieces to play with to make that kind of move. Depending on the move and the team trajectory, it might not matter if you're moving a wide receiver for a tight end or maybe a quarterback. Both are longer lasting positions, so it's not as big of a deal. But if you're at a competitive point and you're trying to add a running back and you don't really have the wide receiver depth to play with, that could be one of the moves that leaves you kind of chasing your tail, which is something we don't want to do in these builds. Be picky about your depth. Don't just take bodies as the answer for your depth. If you have 20 wide receivers on your roster, well, great, but only 4 of them are worth starting any week. Then you don't have a lot of wide receivers, in my opinion. Obviously, there's cases for some stashes, some players who are rookies in development, things like that. Those are guys that you put on your taxi squad. And if they can't fit on your taxi squad and you're still waiting for some sort of breakout, stop it. Aim to improve your depth where you can by consolidating picks and those depth players you have, or multiple depth pieces into draft picks, or better depth pieces, actual depth pieces, or improve your draft capital by pairing it with these replaceable depth pieces as well. It goes without saying, for every single league you're in, know your league, but especially know what your league values, and more importantly, what to do with that information. There are so many roster reviews that come in with the comment, my league doesn't value draft capital, or the inverse where my league overvalues draft capital. And a lot of times that'll lead to a hiccup of what to do with that information. When simply put, if your league overvalues draft capital, with what you can sell rookie picks for, it'll rarely make sense to make your own rookie picks. But try trading down with some of these rookie picks so you can add even more rookie draft capital to sell at inflated values, or you can look to sell outright for high-level proven commodities. And if your league undervalues draft capital, buy as much as you can, as often as you can. This might be a little known fact, but draft picks eventually become players. And if the league overvalues players and undervalues rookie picks, you can rinse and repeat this process where you get rookie picks, they become players, players become overvalued, sell for more rookie picks. And with this process, you can work your way to a massive abundance of assets. And now sometimes the entire league won't share that mindset or either one of these mindsets. But if you can find that one manager or managers that overvalue one side of the fence here, you can play off that and do a lot with that as you try to build dominant dynasty rosters. Talking on rookie picks and player value, you need to understand the flux of market value between players and rookie draft picks. And now is a great time to talk about this, because if your rookie drafts have come and gone, you more than likely know that player value and interest exceeds 2025 pick value for the most part. But if your rookie drafts are still upcoming, your 2024 picks still hold a good bit of value and interest over proven players. Whether it should be or not is up for debate, but fact of the matter is, that's the case. Ultimately, whatever is needed next will always have more value, at least in the public interest mind. Before a rookie draft, you need rookie picks. And after your rookie drafts finish up, before your season and during your season, players are what's needed, especially if you actually want to set a lineup. It's the simple law of supply and demand. Learning how to play on the inverse of these cycles can help you build and retool incredibly quickly. You can look to sell players at peak value in the preseason or in season for future draft capital, and then take that future draft capital and sell that at peak value for proven players after the season is over. And that's another cycle that you can just kind of rinse and repeat. Making consistent moves and staying plugged in will always, almost always, beat out inconsistent managers. We all know those managers that get lucky for no reason. I like to think they're good people and it's good karma, but whatever. I digress. Zach and I have talked about this concept a good bit, but this is the power of compounding consistency. This doesn't mean you're checking your teams every day and sending out as many trade offers as you can, because it's not the team that makes the most moves that wins. It's the team that makes the most quality moves that wins. But ultimately, you should do your due diligence to check in regularly and strike up conversations and see what moves you can make. And another great way to do that is to stay plugged in by finding a community that you enjoy that can help you stay engaged over the course of the very, very long offseason and keep you plugged in with what moves to make during the regular season. And this is another instance where I highly recommend checking out our community Discord through patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get a free 7-day trial, hop in there, see what we can do along with this entire community to help your team. And these are just some of the things we've learned over the course of the last 3 years doing 200 roster reviews, over 200 roster reviews actually, that help people better their teams and win leagues. And as a bonus, enjoy Dynasty that much more. So again, if you want to get your very own roster review, check out the pinned comment below as well as the YouTube description box for details on how to do so. I appreciate y'all for watching. I do hope y'all enjoyed. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below what strategies you look to deploy when you are building a roster, and let us know some questions you might have about building great Dynasty rosters. But with all that said, I'm going to get the heck out of here. I will see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.